It's now time to invite our first guests today, Dr. Angus Hervey and Tane Hunter. While they're making their way up here, let me tell you a little bit about them. Angus and Tane are co-founders of Future Crunch, an organisation of scientists, artists, technologists and entrepreneurs that believe science and technology are creating a world that is more peaceful, transparent and abundant. What a great way to start a conference. Angus is a political journalist specialising in the impact of disruptive technologies on society. He was the founding community manager of Random Hacks of Kindness, I've judged that a couple of times, a global initiative from Google, IBM, NASA and the World Bank to create open source technology solutions to social challenges. Tane is a cancer researcher, bioresearcher and science communicator. He holds a Master's in Bioinformatics from the University of Melbourne and has worked for the Melbourne Royal Children's Hospital in diagnosing rare genetic diseases. Angus and Tane are here to talk on the topic, "The world is not on fire." Please welcome them.
All right, cool. Well, so first of all, my name is Tane, and this is Gus. So he's an economist, which means he'll tell you tomorrow why the things he predicted yesterday didn't happen today.
Oh, thanks, Tane.
So, you know, as
Tane is a scientist who looks like he's just walked out of the set of The Hangover.
I'm still recovering from Saturday night's election. I had to drink some sorrows away there.
So what we thought we'd do today, given that it's been a tough weekend, we thought we'd start off with some shameless bribery. Everyone up for that? Does anyone like chocolate?
All right, cool.
All right, you have to earn this chocolate, and the way you're going to do this is you're going to answer some questions. So team up with someone next to you. You're going to form a team. Pair up with the person next to you, and we want you to answer a simple question. What have been the biggest news stories of 2019? You can write this down on a piece of paper. You can put it on your phone. And we want you to come up very quickly with 10 of the biggest news stories of 2019. Everyone got that? Great.
Okay, let's wrap things up. So we're going to do a little game. All right, everyone, we got our 10 news stories. So I'll go through the top news stories of 2019 so far, and you get a point for each one that you get right that we show you. So keep score, right? Keep tally. So 1 point for story. If you chose the worst news story of 2019, you get a point for the Australian election. All right, so tally a point if you got that. How about Notre Dame? Unfortunately, maybe the Sri Lankan bombings. The terrible stuff in Christchurch. But Jacinda did a great job handling that. Yep. I think Jacinda is now the most trusted politician in Australia. All right, anyone go for the Brexit kerfuffle? Nice, good work. We got the horrible stuff going on in Venezuela, unfortunately. Something close to home for me. I'm from New Mexico in the United States. Making abortion illegal. Apparently making unborn babies great again. We have the terrible stuff that happened in the Murray-Darling Basin. Anything about plastic, you get a point for that. I mean, basically climate change in general. Melting of the ice caps, fires, extinction. We're doing a great job. And anything to do, of course, everything's overshadowed with he who shall not be named. Go 2 points for this asshole. All right, so we're going to give chocolate to the top winners who get 10 out of 10 or potentially 11 if you put Twitler or Donald Vader in there. All right, so who got 7 out of 10? All right. So 2, 3 people. All right, who got 8 out of 10? All right. Who got 9 out of 10? 9 out of 10? Anyone get 10 out of 10? Okay. 11 out of 10? 9 out of 10, yep. 10 out of 10. Woo! I reckon we go backwards. Let's go. We got heaps of chocolate. So how about 9 eighters? 7s. Oh. You might, if there are two people sitting next to each other, you're going to have to share it. Yeah, table. If you got tables. One behind you, Gus. See, this is why we wear bright colored jackets and give away chocolate. It's all flash and zero substance. So now, Gus is going to play the next half of the game.
All right, for this one, you get 2 bars of chocolate if you get more than 2 out of 10. All right, 187 countries just signed the strongest trade accord in the banning of plastic waste across borders ever last week at the UN. Anyone? Okay. The number of incarcerated people in American prisons has declined again to 1.48 million people. That's down from 1.61 million in 2009. Anyone? Okay. A new Ebola vaccine is out. It's 97.5% effective. It's been administered to over 90,000 health workers on the front lines for Ebola. Anyone? Put your hand up if you get any of these. Malawi has just eliminated trachoma. That's the leading infectious cause of blindness worldwide. It's the second African country to do that, actually, after Ghana. Anyone get that one? The Philippines has just passed a Universal Healthcare Act entitling 107 million citizens to universal healthcare. Anybody get that one? No? The indigenous Warani community of Ecuador has won a landmark case against oil companies protecting 180,000 hectares of their land against exploitation in perpetuity. Anybody? Great. All right. Those people need some chocolate. South Korea has just announced their latest food recycling statistics. They used to recycle 2% of food waste. They now recycle 95%. Anybody? Anyone get that one?
Yeah. Well done.
Great. Germany's greenhouse gas emissions have declined by 4.2% in 2018. That is the 4th largest economy on the planet and the largest economy in Europe. Anybody get that? Chile has just taken over management of a 10 million acre park following the largest land private donation in human history. You obviously read our newsletter. That happened 2 weeks ago. That's 10 million hectares in Patagonia, also in perpetuity. Anybody get that? Nope. Costa Rica is now covered, half of the country is covered in forest. They've doubled forest cover in the last 30 years. That is a huge carbon sink and a massive draw for tourists. Did anybody get Costa Rica? That happened last week. Did anybody get more than... Oh, you got Costa Rica. All right, we'll see if we can get some chocolate tea. I think we might have run out. Did anybody get 9 out of 9? Did anyone get 2 out of 9? Great. Did anyone get 1 out of 9? Fantastic, congratulations. Okay, I think you've kind of seen our point, right? So, why is it that we all know about those stories, but none of us, we got there's 8 out of 9, 7 out of 9s, but none of us have heard of these stories? Well, that question kind of hit me like a ton of bricks in 2013 after the last federal election. I just finished my PhD. I'm a forester. I was an environmental economist looking at deforestation. And after a decade spent in academia trying to understand why people cut down forests, I was broken. I'd spent so long looking at the problems that I'd forgotten how to look at the solutions. Because I felt like the world was a terrible place and I wanted to do something about it. And so I went out there to try and understand what was going on. The problem is because I was only looking at the problems, I'd forgotten what the solutions looked like, and I spiraled downwards into a really terrible depression. For months, didn't eat properly, wasn't drinking properly, I didn't speak to my friends, I stopped speaking to my loved ones, which is always really weird when you get depressed. Why is it that we shut off from the people that love us most? And then just when I felt I couldn't go on anymore, I read an article by the English journalist George Monbiot, and he said that as environmentalists, if we had deliberately set out to alienate as many people as possible, we couldn't have done better if we'd tried. For 50 years, we've been telling people the stories of doom. And that's been a really great way to get everyone's attention, but it's a terrible way to drive action. So I decided that day that I would no longer give in to the stories of fear. And at around that time, I met Tane. And together, the two of us started Future Crunch. And what we did is thought, if we change our radar and we start looking for the solutions, what kind of world can we see? And the world suddenly started looking very different. So what we're going to do for the next 45 minutes or so is we're going to show you what we found. Is everyone up for that? Sure? Okay, great. All right, so let's do it.
Yeah. All right. So there's another story out there, one backed by evidence and science, that tells us something very different about the world. For example, Franklin Roosevelt once said, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance for those who have much. It's whether we have enough for those who have too little." And if we use that as our mark of progress, the world looks like a very different place. For example, the World Bank newest figures on extreme poverty, it's dropped to 8.6% of the global population. That is the lowest proportion and absolute number in human history. And on average, since yesterday, 130,000 people have been brought out of extreme poverty. This is soul-destroying. One meal a day, no dentist, no doctor, one accident, one illness could lead to end of life. Soul-destroying poverty. And if you get one meal, it's probably some gray porridge sludge. And if you're lucky to have clean water, you probably have to walk miles a day to get it. So 130,000 people every day don't have to do that. That should be one of the major news stories we read in the paper every single day.
Now, global inequality is decreasing as well. Many of you remember a world, the first and the third world, when we grew up. That world no longer exists anymore. There is now a massive chunk of people in the middle, the new global middle class. And in fact, the Brookings Institute says that 1 in 2 people on the planet now are classified as middle class, which means they can afford a motorcycle, they can afford healthcare sometimes, they have enough money at the end of the week to go to the movies. Quality of life is improving too. 91% of the world's population now has access to an improved water source. Tane, that's up from 76% in the 1990s, right?
Exactly. Quality of life is totally improving worldwide. And in one major story can everyone hear me with this? Because I like to walk around and kind of flap my arms around.
All right, I'll anchor you here at the desk.
Okay, cool. You be the grounding, the straight line, I'll be the wiggly line. All right, so 500 million people in India, and one of the greatest stories of sanitation of all time, don't have to defecate in the streets anymore. Since 2014, they have installed 90 million toilets, and the vast majority of households now have access to a toilet, something that we often take for granted. It looks like finally humanity is taking care of their shit. In the past 25 years, 2 billion people have gained access to electricity. In places like Bangladesh, in the last 10 years, it's gone from 20% having access to electricity up to 80%. That means you can do your homework at night. You can have a refrigerator, watch the television, hopefully not elections, especially Australian ones. Electricity is something we often take for granted. Despite popular belief, thanks to better preparedness and early warning systems, less people are dying from natural disasters than at any point in recorded human history.
Now, war and violence are also declining. In fact, the global murder rate has declined in the majority of countries for the last decade. There are 180,000 people walking around today who would have been murdered if murder rates globally had stayed the same as they did a decade ago. The world is becoming less violent. In places like the United States, the crime rate has come down by more than 5% every year in the last 5 years. And in Australia, the murder rate has dropped to its lowest rate ever recorded. That made front page news in every Australian newspaper, right? What about terrorism? Well, despite the fact that we see the main headline news around terrorism, what most of us don't realize is that terrorism has actually declined markedly since its peak in 2014. Attacks from Daesh are down by 50% in the last year. Terrorist attacks are down by 33% in the last year. Fewer people are affected by terrorism in war-torn countries, which is where the majority of terrorism actually takes place. And the world is becoming more peaceful. And that sounds like fake news, right? But it turns out that following the peace accord between the rebels in Colombia in 2016, all of the war in the world is now contained to an arc that stretches from Nigeria through to Pakistan, that contains less than a sixth of the world's population. What that means is that war now affects fewer people than at any other point in human history. And within that arc, things are getting better too. Boko Haram is on the retreat in many of its territories. The terrible violence in Pakistan over the last few years has abated significantly. And the carnage in the Middle East, despite how horrific it's become, in some places is starting to get better as well. You'll often hear military leaders say that we live in the most dangerous times ever. Statistically speaking, that's the fake news. War now kills fewer people than at any other point in human history. It's just that our visibility on it has improved.
All right, so what about wars, one of war's fellow horsemen of the apocalypse, famine? Well, the world population suffering from hunger is now at around 11%, down from around 15% in 2010. And even those people who are hungry have less of a caloric deficit, from 155 calories to 88 calories. Now, 20% more food is produced per person since 2006. I mean, yes, some of our agricultural practices are unsustainable and questionable, but we're seeing this new rise of combining modern and traditional techniques, such as regenerative agriculture, things like vertical farming. And that's popping up all over the world. And to be honest, there's plenty of food on the planet. There's no deficit. We just need to get much better about how we distribute it and our food wastage. So famine is on a decades-long decline. It's the lowest. There's been a recent uptick in Yemen, thanks to political unrest and war, but the trend is very clear. We're seeing less people affected by famine than at any other time in human history.
Okay, so what is it that actually does kill people? If war doesn't kill people and famine doesn't kill people, then perhaps it's something else. Well, if you look at the leading causes of death globally, you'll see that in general, it's the other horseman of the apocalypse, pestilence, that kills most human beings. Interestingly here, you'll see there's one country where road injuries kill more people than any other, Saudi Arabia. Any ideas why that might be the case?
Not enough women drivers on the road.
So, Tane, if we're all being killed by disease, how are we doing over there? What kind of diseases actually kill us?
Well, it's largely the main ones are the non-communicable ones, the non-infectious ones. Cardiovascular disease takes the cake. Cancer, respiratory disease, and diabetes are the top four. And if you look back at that graph, natural disasters are, it's basically non-existent. Bad doctor's handwriting kills more people than natural disasters. All right, so thanks to amazing healthcare. So I work down the road at Peter Mac. I'm a cancer researcher. I read the code of life DNA and figure out what particular changes are causing cancer. But cancer, diabetes, respiratory issues are all on a decline. For example, cancer is down by 22% here in Australia since the 1980s. And that is thanks to the incredible minds of doctors, researchers, scientists, nurses, and volunteers that have led to that. And keep in mind, we are just getting started. Dementia is actually on the decline. For example, it's down by 20% in the UK, thanks to better diagnosis and largely better diet. We're feeding ourselves in better ways.
So what about infectious diseases? Well, we're on the verge of eradicating polio. That is a disease that used to kill, cripple, and maim hundreds of thousands of people within the memories of many people probably in this room. Polio cases in the wild are now down to 17 globally last year in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the last two places where this terrible disease actually exists. At the beginning of this year, the World Health Organization announced that it now has a vaccine for cholera. Cholera is a disease that at various times in human history we've called the Great Death. It's killed tens of millions of our fellow citizens. And we now have a new malaria vaccine that's just started to be rolled out in Malawi. Ghana and Kenya are about to follow suit. Malaria is the deadliest infectious disease on the planet at the moment. We finally invented a vaccine that's cheap enough and effective enough to start fighting back against this deadly foe. And as we mentioned in the beginning, there is a new Ebola vaccine now in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That vaccine is still in its experimental stages, but it's been shown to be highly effective and is starting to be rolled out to all frontline health workers.
Now, 6 billion people around the world are getting vaccinated, and it's largely due to volunteers helping out. 86% of children are now vaccinated for some of our age-old killers.
Mexico became the first country in the Americas to eliminate trachoma in 2017. Ghana became the first country to eliminate it in 2018. And as we said, Malawi just became the second African country to eliminate trachoma. That is the leading infectious cause of blindness worldwide. This again is thanks to the unprecedented rollout and concentration on healthcare by hundreds of health workers, clinics, by a lot of African countries who are starting to prioritize this disease. Rwanda has just achieved universal eye care for all of its 12 million citizens. Rwanda has one of the leading healthcare systems on the African continent. There are 12,000 registered nurses all across the country linked digitally by mobile phones who are starting to take better care of its citizens. AIDS. In South Africa, my home country, there has been a 44% drop in AIDS cases since 2012. That is the country with more AIDS patients than any other on the planet. And UNAIDS is now saying, in fact, that thanks to the rollout of ARVs and treatments, we're now looking perhaps at the end of this disease by the 2030s. And malaria, the deadliest infectious disease on the planet, we've managed to reduce malaria cases by more than half since 2000. So 440,000 people a year are now walking around who didn't die from malaria compared to just a generation ago. That is an extraordinary global healthcare achievement, but it's just not something that we talk about.
Now, as a result of treating these preventable diseases, since 1990, we've saved the lives of 122 million children. That is one of the greatest stories humanity has ever had to tell, yet we just don't hear about it. And the lives of those kids are improving as well. New statistics from UNESCO say 94% of boys and girls around the world are learning to read and write. So we're going to have a generation that's much more literate than the current ones. And they'll also have a lot of spell checking on the way as well. So 98 million children. This is one of my favorite statistics. The International Labour Organization announced at the end of last year that 98 million fewer children actually get a childhood. They're not forced into slavery and sex work.
What about political and civil discourse and tolerance? I mean, that's getting worse, isn't it? Well, it depends on where you're looking, because if you look at a historical trend, in fact, democracy globally has never really been healthier. What we do is we tend to concentrate on the minute ups and downs of the last few years, and we forget that globally, democracy is now by far the most popular choice for most countries, and that authoritarian regimes largely are in the decline. This year, 1.9 billion voters will vote around the world in countries like Nigeria, India, South Africa, Indonesia. These are countries with hundreds of millions of people in them. This is the largest number of voters in human history. Never before have so many people had the democratic right to choose their leaders at any other point in human history. You might have all heard the stories from the Philippines or from Brazil about the decline of democracy, but we didn't hear about what's going on in Ethiopia with the election of Abiy Ahmed, their new prime minister, a new democratic superstar. He said, from this time on, war is not an option for the people of Eritrea and Ethiopia. What we need now is love. It's not just Jacinda Ardern. And we're also starting to see better representation. 23.9% of women in parliaments around the world. That's still a shockingly low number, but it's up from 11 or 12% at the beginning of this century. That's a doubling of women in parliaments around the world. And as more voices start to get heard, we start to get better policies for a wider proportion of our populations. Morocco has just passed a new law making violence against women illegal, strong new controls against domestic violence. In Nepal, they've banned the practice of chapati, which is when women are menstruating, they have to be separate from the community. That practice is now banned and is punishable by jail time. And female genital mutilation is down to 8% in East Africa, still a shocking proportion, but it used to be 71% a generation ago.
That's huge.
So in North Africa, East Africa, West Africa, we've seen a dramatic decline in FGM practices in just one generation. And on International Women's Day in 2016, India made it compulsory for all women working in public and private establishments to get 26 weeks of maternity leave. That is a country of 1.2 billion people. Think about the change that single regulation is going to cause.
So Denmark became the first country to take transgenderism off the mental illness list. Canada was a country recently that made it illegal to discriminate against transgender people. Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland has made it compulsory for state curriculum to include information about LGBTQI rights and sexual health. Now, so Germany was the 8th country to have a passport that added a 3rd option for gender, other. After Canada, the 7th. After the 6th, which was Pakistan. Now, Serbia, Ana Brnabić, was the first openly gay and woman prime minister. And even the Fighting Irish, Leo Varadkar. Oh, yeah, I always get the name wrong. He's the first gay prime minister of, the typically male-dominated Fighting Irish. So Taiwan became the 25th nation in the world to make gay marriage legal, the first Asian country, before Australia. And they did it 4 days before they made it illegal to eat cats and dogs. This stuff can actually be quantified in saving human lives. In the United States, since same-sex marriage was legalized, we've seen a reduction of 14% in suicides in the LGBTQI community. This stuff is important.
And here's an incredible story, which is that global suicide rates have declined by 38% since 1994.
Sounds like fake news.
That doesn't sound correct because so many of us are concentrating on mental health issues in our own communities. But for most of the world, life has gotten better in the last generation. The reason these suicide rates have declined so drastically is because young women, mostly in India and China, are no longer forced to marry at a young age and forced into situations where they feel like they have no hope. And in the Global World Values Survey, 85% of countries surveyed said that happiness has increased in the last decade. 7 in 10 people said that they experienced enjoyment, felt well rested, and smiled or laughed a lot on the day before the survey. And 87% of people on the planet now say that they are treated with respect.
That was the largest international survey ever conducted, right?
Absolutely.
And a lot of these statistics and understanding come from science. And science can give us insight into why these stories are so surprising to us. For example, I'm a science nerd, a biology nerd. I've had a love affair with the study of life since I can remember. But that wasn't my first career. The first career was actually a mountain biker. I got a US national title, and everything was looking pretty sweet until I broke my back. And that all fell away. The reason I got up in the morning, my reason for being was taken away. After a bit of healing and a lot of self-reflection, I decided to go sailing, of course. And so I ended up going from the Galapagos sailing to New Zealand, where I lived for a couple of years. Yeah, kia ora, go Kiwis. And halfway through at the Cook Islands, as serendipity would have it, I ran into a whale dissection. And I got interested and wanted to have a look. And so I was fascinated. My sailing across the ocean made me fall in love with all the marine creatures. They're so alien and interesting and beautiful. And a lot of things like dolphins and whales, show a lot of human anthropomorphic sort of emotions. So I really wanted to be a marine biologist. So I went to this whale dissection, and it was hot, disgusting, stinky, volunteer-led, and a lot of them gave up, so I put my hand up. So for 3 days, I helped dissect this whale for scientific research and to understand why it had beached itself, because we're seeing that around the world, so important work. And this woman from Harvard Medical School, Darlene Kenton, to her I professed my love of marine biology. And she said, "That's great, but it is a saturated field. All the cool animals are taken. You're going to do your PhD on like a sea sponge or something like that." And she said, why not learn something like genetics, the code of life? Because if you learn to understand that, you can apply it to all facets within biology. So I gallivanted around New Zealand for a while, did some hospitality and winemaking, but my mind was atrophying, and that love of biology was always there. So then I came to Melbourne to learn to study genetics and the code of life. And now at Peter Mac, I write machine learning, AI algorithms that read DNA and figure out the changes that cause particular cancer. We follow patient treatment and figure out whether resistant strains are emerging so we can change track and hopefully improve patient outcome. But science is much more than medical advancements. For example, the wise Carl Sagan once said, "Science isn't just a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking. And it's a way of skeptically interrogating the universe with a fine understanding of human frailty. It is the best method that we all have to make sense of this world around us. And unlike ideology, science, it allows for correction. So it constantly evolves. And given just a single piece of contrary evidence, it insists we rethink everything that we once knew. And as scientists, when we get it wrong, we actually get excited because it means we've learned something. That's why science is fucking amazing. Some science fans out there.
So what does any of this have to do with this talk?
So science, and in particular, well, I'm a scientist, so I got to nerd out a little bit. But neuroscience can give us great insight into why some of these incredible news stories are so surprising to us. So inside my brain, inside Gus's brain, inside all of your brains is an alarm bell. It's a small almond-shaped set of neurons called the amygdala. And when we see something dangerous or scary and we read those bad headlines and watch the Australian election, it overrides all higher functioning parts of the brain. It's called the amygdala hijack, and we stop thinking rationally. And evolutionary, it's part of the reason our feet are moving before we realize it's a crocodile jumping out of the water at you. And to make things even worse, we have what's called negativity bias, which is the psychological phenomenon by which bad news, bad emotions, bad experiences go straight into long-term memory, but the good stuff takes much longer to sink in. So in effect, all of our brains, they're like Velcro for the bad stuff and like Teflon for the good.
Now, the problem is that in today's world, the biggest threat isn't predators with teeth, it's predators with cameras. Because the media knows that you're primed to look for negative stimuli, and they use it to sell you stuff. So in a 2015 study at the University of Michigan, they showed that we tend to linger about 30% longer on bad news stories when we're looking at good news or bad news. And when we read bad news, it actually has a physiological effect. Our heart rate goes up and our sweat output increases. Humans are empathy machines. We're pretty good at taking other people's emotions and feeling them ourselves. Anyone got sweaty palms? So what we're doing is when we see other things going on in the world, we actually take on board those emotions ourselves.
And then to make things even more complex, we have what's known as confirmation bias. And it's incredibly powerful knowledge. It won Daniel Kahneman a Nobel Prize in 2002. And it's part of the reason that we've, it's our tendency to actively seek out information that confirms our pre-existing notions. And it's part of the reasons that we've all woken up in our filter bubbles, bad news bubbles, pointing at each other and saying, you're the ones with the fake news. And then we have the availability heuristic, which is we give more importance to the news that we've heard most recently, and it's easily accessible in the brain, and often negative. Then we got the backfire effect. So when we form these really strong views about the world and they're challenged, we really dig in and fight harder to stay with those beliefs. I mean, everyone's felt that, right? When you're challenged, you get defensive.
So when you combine all these things together, you get these horrible feedback loops. The media pushes bad news at you because they know that's what gets your attention, it's what sells. And then when we read the bad news, we feel bad about the world. So then we go out looking for more news that confirms our belief that the world is bad. And there's plenty of that available out there. It's available on all the channels, on your phone screens, on Facebook feed. And so then the whole cycle kind of starts again. You've heard the expression, if it bleeds, it leads. That's not a colloquialism coined by some cutthroat tabloid editor. That's a potent evolutionary truth that lies at the heart of the modern-day media machine. The media doesn't tell you what's going on in the world. The news does not tell you what's happening. The news tells you what's rare. There's another aphorism in newsrooms, which is that we never write stories about planes that land. So when you are reading the news, it's not keeping you informed. The news is giving you a negative image of the world, both tonally and photographically, and that tends to warp our view of what's actually going on. And the problem is, because we're all on social media, we're sharing that news now. These are the two most shared news stories on Facebook in 2019.
Which one's fake, Gus?
Well, the problem, what's going on is that when you give 4 billion apes the ability to share news with each other, it turns out that the thing we like doing most is sharing news about tigers in bushes. And that's how we operate. And so we're in the middle of this kind of fear virus. Every time something bad happens on the planet, it sweeps through the global community like wildfire, kind of leaving us all paralyzed. And because we've kind of trained our brains to seek out those stories, we actually rewire them and we get neuroplasticity kicking in, and it means that we actively start seeking out the information that confirms that bias. You know how you know it's harder to read at nighttime now to pick up a book? The reason is because you changed your brain by looking at too many news stories on your phone.
And that's why things like Ebola make headlines. But the incredible new vaccine for Ebola didn't make any magazine cover. And speaking of vaccines, I'm very sorry if there's any anti-vaxxers here. But I do want to point out that the doctor who originally published that study in 2006, it was retracted and he lost his medical license. Most of the information about anti-vaxxers has actually been pushed by Russian artificial intelligence bots to disseminate misinformation to divide communities. Just keep that in mind. But things like Ebola make headlines in its big epidemic, but bad doctors' handwriting did not, even though it killed more people than natural disasters and Ebola. It's why we celebrate things that are dangerous and scary, professions like firemen. We had to work a lot for that photo.
You had to work hard a lot for that.
But we don't celebrate things like nursing. And nurses actually save more lives. The reason they save more lives? Well, they can read the bad handwriting of doctors.
And then you've got the predators in front of the cameras. Because the media knows that you're primed to look for negative stimuli, but so do the politicians. And they use negative stimuli and bad news to sell you stuff too. So on the right, they tell us that crime, terrorism, immigration are coming. On the left, we all say that bankers are the devil and that capitalism is a predatory system. And the environmentalists tell us that water war's on the horizon, that the forests are dying, the oceans are burning, and we're all on a collision course with a climate change time bomb.
Now, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, I'm pretty sure most of us are on the same aisle in this room, but regardless of what your political beliefs are and your ideology, the problem with this fear-based rhetoric, which dominates modern-day media and politics, is why it may galvanize a few people into action. For the vast majority of humanity, it breeds cynicism, apathy, hopelessness, and hate. And those emotions don't create solutions.
We should be preparing for a world in which things are getting better. Optimism doesn't have to be a reaction to the world around you. It's a choice by which you can navigate the world around you. And once you make that choice, the world suddenly starts looking very differently. And so what I'd like to do over here is, I know that we've kind of reached maximum time, but if you'd if you're happy for us to do this, would like to spend the 10 minutes on these last 10 minutes to talk about the thing that we're probably most passionate about, which is what's going on in the environment globally. Is everyone up for that? 10 minutes of what's happening with the environment? We want to show you what happens when you switch that filter and you start looking for the solutions rather than the problems.
And thanks to science, we're going to be digging a lot less black rocks and dinosaur juice oil out of the ground. We're going to be getting it from the sun, the most sustainable resource in the planet. Our winds, our tides, and our molten core. Yet, you know, our screens are filled daily with trouser-thrusting politicians. But ignore that, because there's a quiet revolution going on in the background. And it's not being driven by politics or environmentalism or altruism. It's being driven by the bloodless logic of the marketplace. So worldwide, we are well past the cusp that we're spending more on renewable energy than dirty energy. In fact, we spend more than twice the amount on clean energy than we do on dirty energy. So now, in many places in every country in the world, it is cheaper to build new solar and wind than it is to build new coal plants. That's already done. In many countries now, it's actually cheaper to build new solar and wind farms than it is to continue running our existing coal infrastructure. This stuff is starting to bite. For example, the UK, the first industrial revolution, they just went a week without burning coal. That's the first time since they started igniting those black rocks since 1882. And coal plants like this are long gone. Let's be honest, they've been replaced by penthouses for rich Russian oligarchs. But a few kilometers down the Thames, the iconic Blackfriars Bridge, it's covered in super sexy solar panels. Did you know that Saudi Arabia, the largest producer and exporter of oil in the world, has now announced a solar plant so big it's going to power the entire country by 2030?
The United States, here's a figure for you. 3/4. That is the proportion of coal plants in the United States that are now more expensive to run than to build new local renewable energy. They're actually calling this the coal cost crossover in the US. And last month, for the first time in US history, the country generated more electricity from renewable sources than it did from coal. Now, climate change might be controversial in the United States, but you know what isn't controversial? Clean energy. 3/4. That is the proportion of US wind farms that have been built in states that voted Republican in 2016.
Yeehaw!
The reason clean energy is popular in the United States? Jobs. There are 3 million jobs in the clean energy sector in the United States compared to 50,000 coal jobs. The media loves reporting on the coal jobs because that's bad news, but no one ever goes and interviews the people who are installing solar panels on the roof in the Bronx. This guy, in the first 2 years of his administration, the United States closed more coal plants than during the entire 8 years of the Obama administration. It turns out that he who shall not be named truly is making America great again. 3/4. India, the percentage of new electricity added to the grid from wind and solar in 2018.
This is one of the great last hopes of the coal barons. In fact, their energy minister, Piyush Goyal, has publicly stated that coal is too expensive, too risky, and they want to stop imports as soon as possible. Sorry, Adani.
3/4. That's the percentage of public electricity that was generated from renewable energy in Germany on Easter Monday this year. You need nuclear and coal for baseload power, right? Wrong. Because in a figure that should strike fear into the heart of every fossil fuel dinosaur on the planet, 3/4. That is the percentage price drop in batteries since 2012. You'll hear cynics say that wind and solar can't ever meet the demand, but they're looking at the wrong indicators. The last few years have been about getting the prices down. The question now is how fast can we deploy? And the good news here is that we can deploy pretty rapidly.
Yeah, and the technology is improving all the time. Modern wind turbines, they're marvels of human ingenuity and engineering savvy. They have twice the capacity and generate 4 times the amount of electricity than their predecessors just a few years ago. We're taking their ginormous blades offshore to harness the power of gales. In our deserts, we are seeing huge fields of gleaming glass, which harness energy from the sun, pillars of molten salt, and gigafactories that are popping up in the deserts of Nevada, Mongolia, and Spain that are churning out the batteries of the future generation of this energy revolution.
And that revolution isn't just about wind, solar, and batteries. It's about artificial intelligence for grid management, blockchain for energy distribution. It's about a new decentralized grid that's fit for the 21st century, about solar floating farms that have been floated out over old coal quarries, about a new hydrogen economy that's emerging, a new lithium mining boom. We're talking vertical farming, precision agriculture. We're talking zero carbon building materials.
And we're even installing solar into clear glass, thanks to a father-son team in Perth. Check it out.
For us, it's about another Australian first and really getting ourselves out there in terms of thinking about the next phase of our integrated energy and solar rollout. So there's lots of roof space, and we'll eventually take all that up, and we can take a functional form that sits around us here in Chadstone, for example, windows and glass, atriums, and turn that into clean energy for our centres.
So imagine a city like Melbourne, where every high-rise window, every car windscreen, our smartphone screens, are energy-producing cells, and you begin to realize that cities, towns, communities can be their own energy-producing power plants.
Okay, so that's energy. What about the environment?
I'm glad you asked, because there's some good news there as well. So forests are regenerating in Europe, China, and the United States and Canada. So China, over the last 18 years, has spent $21 billion on the largest and most successful conservation effort of all time, resulting in a forest the size of Victoria. Last year, they deployed 60,000 soldiers that planted a forest the size of Ireland. They're making trees, not war. Now, India broke a record in 2017 by planting 66 million trees by volunteers in a community-led effort. That's pretty cool, but not to be outdone by their fierce rivals, Pakistan. They've announced the billion tree tsunami. They've already planted 1 billion trees, and they want to get to 10 billion in the next 5 years. Now, led by an Australian conservationist, they've planted 200 million trees since 1980. They're calling it the Great Green Wall. Not only does it stop desertification, it brings the temperature down, allows for regenerative agriculture, better cropping, and it's created thousands of jobs for the local community. And that's why I haven't heard much about famines in that area. So this is a satellite image from NASA culminating all of the forestation tree cover around the world since 2000. And it turns out that despite loss in the Amazon and some of Africa, forest cover has increased by 5% since 2000. We've got a long way to go, but it's not all bad news, and it's largely thanks to India, China, and Australia's not doing too bad.
Ocean conservation, the last 3 years have been absolutely fantastic globally. We created the largest ocean reserve in human history off the coast of Antarctica, 1.5 million square kilometers. In Canada, they created a new area called the Serengeti of the Arctic. It's the largest park in Canadian history, and it was signed in collaboration, in partnership with their Indigenous communities, in a full treaty between sovereign nations in Canada and the government to create this incredible new park. In Argentina, they've created two new marine national parks, Birdwood 2 and Yaganes. This is home to some of the most diverse and abundant marine life on the planet. And Atlantic tuna stocks are recovering in the eastern Atlantic thanks to better regulations from European regulators to stop overfishing. The Belize Reef, the second largest reef on the planet, the second largest barrier reef on the planet, that's been taken off the endangered list in the last year, following, according to UNESCO. And UNESCO said that follows visionary steps by the Belize government. And Belize has also doubled the amount of ocean conservation that it's doing now. 12% of its waters are now protected, up from 6%. That happened about a month ago. What about the global fight against plastic? Well, here in Australia, plastic bag usage is down by 80% since we saw Coles and Woolworths stop distributing plastic bans. And since the beginning of this year, we've seen 11 countries implement plastic bans across the world. A 12th country actually just joined them, that's Tanzania. They announced that last week. And interestingly, a lot of these efforts to ban plastic are being led by communities. The plastic ban in Bali was led by 2 teenage sisters who mobilized the community to get those regulations passed.
And another amazing community-led initiative in Mumbai, Versova Beach. So a 32-year-old accountant decided he was sick of seeing the beach looking like that and decided to pick up trash an hour a day. And people started joining him. Over a year and a half, they turned the beach from what it looked like to this. It is the largest beach cleanup in the world. And 127 weeks after the cleanup, turtles are returning for the first time in 20 years.
137 countries signed up to the strongest controls in trade in endangered animals ever in 2017. Elephant poaching is down by more than half in Kenya following the ban on ivory trading in China. Gorilla populations have almost doubled in the last 10 years in the forests of Central and Eastern Africa. And the brown bear, the sea turtle, the manatee, the peregrine falcon, the panda, and the humpback whale have all been taken off the endangered list in the last decade.
So we still have a long way to go, but these are some of the great unsung environmental stories of our time, and we really should be celebrating them.
So let's wrap this up, and we thank you very much for your patience and sticking with us through a couple of these sound issues and also into your tea break. Why did we come here today to tell you these stories? Well, we want to be clear. We get it. We know that the world is not a perfect place, and many of you are on the front lines in witnessing that. We understand that this incredible surge of progress hasn't reached everybody. And we also understand that we have incredible issues that we face: climate change, environmental destruction, radical political beliefs, religious extremism, inequality, intolerance, and 5 million children still die unnecessarily every year of preventable diseases. Hundreds of millions of people cannot access the basic freedoms that we all take for granted. But in order to be strong enough for the next 3 years, in order to take this fight back, to get organized, to get angry, you have to be able to hold 2 ideas in your head at once. The world is getting better, and the world is not yet good enough. And what it means is that our successes in the past should give us confidence as communities as we move forward into the future. So ask yourself, for the next 3 years, can you bring your own weather to the picnic? Can you change your mindset and start to look for the solutions in an effort to see if we can hack this terrible negativity bias that all of us seem to have when we talk about social and environmental change?
And let's change our information diet. Understand that the information that comes towards us affects how we feel about the world and stops the way we can engage within it. Now, we understand the internet, where we got all this information from, is a dark and scary place, full of ghosts and ghouls, Trump's trolls, rabbit holes of cat videos. So if you're looking for a good place to start, we have a newsletter. It'll win you chocolate at our next event. So it's free. It comes out fortnightly. We don't do anything with your data, just like what you click on. And we curate stories of good news that's outside the main headlines, and about stories of science and technology and the hundreds of millions of people on our planet that are working together to make the world a better place. And we'd like to leave you with this. Remember that we should cultivate an attitude of optimism. Because cynicism, it's easy. You're never wrong or surprised or disappointed when things go bad. By contrast, if we describe the way a better future can be built, we redraw the boundaries of what's possible and show that it could include paths, for instance, that lead to the end of climate change, war, disease, and asshole politicians. And we can freely admit that there are big challenges.
And we can also admit the difficulty of what we face, but we can also believe that our best hope lies in an intelligent and courageous optimism. And if we combine that with science and technology and a common belief and love for each other, then that gives us superpowers as we move forward into the next phase of this fight. So
Yeah.
thank you very much for having us. We hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. We apologize again for going slightly over time in the technical issues, and we wish you all the best of luck for the next 3 years, because they're going to be tricky.
Continue the good fight.